A cashier shared her lunch with a homeless stranger who turned out to be the disgraced vampire king. Until that moment, he'd been wandering cursed and forgotten for 70 years. Her small act of grace restored his ancient strength, and now he's appeared before her with an impossible demand. Marry him by dawn, or every vampire clan will hunt her as the king's unclaimed mate. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Emma Chen had been invisible for so long that she barely noticed it anymore. The way customers looked through her at the cigarette display behind the counter, the way her own reflection in the quick-stop window seemed faded like an old photograph, the way even her parents called less frequently now that she'd dropped out of Portland State and taken this graveyard shift to pay off her student loans. 3 nights in a row she'd watched the homeless man huddled against the brick wall across the street, rain soaking through whatever layers he wore, and each night she'd felt that familiar tug of recognition, the way loneliness called to loneliness across the fluorescent wasteland of southeast Portland at midnight. Her mother had packed dumplings again, the pork and chive ones that took hours to fold, each pleat a small act of love that Emma usually ate mechanically during her 2 a.m. break while scrolling through social media posts from college friends whose lives had continued forward while hers had frozen in this bright cage of lottery tickets and energy drinks. But tonight at 11:47 p.m., when she looked out and saw him shivering, something shifted in her chest, some impulse she couldn't name, and before she could talk herself out of it, she grabbed the container and pushed through the door into October rain that smelled like wet asphalt and Douglas fir. He looked up as she approached, and his eyes were wrong, too aware, too ancient. But she was committed now, so she held out the dumplings and said they were still warm. Her mom made them. He should eat. His hands when he reached for the container were trembling, filthy, and the moment his fingers touched hers, the world went white. Emma staggered back as the man before her transformed, dirt and grime sliding off him like water, revealing skin pale as moonlight and features that belonged in a Renaissance painting. All sharp cheekbones and a mouth made for cruelty or kissing, she couldn't tell which, and his eyes flashed crimson, actual glowing red like something from a movie. Except this was real. This was happening, and he whispered impossible in a voice like velvet over broken glass, before he vanished, literally disappeared into shadows that shouldn't exist under streetlights. Emma stood in the rain holding nothing, her hand still extended, and told herself she'd hallucinated from exhaustion, from too many 12-hour shifts, from the loneliness that had been eating her alive for 3 years. But her fingers tingled where he'd touched her, and the container of dumplings was gone. And when she went back inside, the fluorescent lights felt different, harsher, like they were trying too hard to push back darkness that had learned her name. She made it through the next 2 hours on autopilot, scanning cigarettes and lottery tickets for the insomniacs and sex workers and night shift nurses who comprised her regular customers, all of them looking through her the way they always did, and she'd almost convinced herself it had been a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and her mother's concerned phone calls about when she'd get her life together, when the lights flickered at exactly 2 a.m. Frost crept across the windows despite the heating, her breath suddenly visible in clouds, and he was simply there between one heartbeat and the next, standing in the middle of the store, though she'd locked the doors an hour ago, wearing clothes from another century, actual breeches, and a shirt with too many buttons, and a coat that belonged in a museum. Emma's scream caught in her throat as he raised both hands in a gesture she thought might be surrender, except his eyes were still that impossible crimson, and she could see fangs, actual fangs, when he spoke. 70 years I wandered, he said, and his accent was strange, formal, words chosen too carefully like English wasn't his first language, even though he spoke it perfectly. Cursed to be invisible, untouchable, neither living nor dead, and your kindness, freely given expecting nothing in return, it broke what ancient magic sealed. Emma backed against the counter, her hand finding the baseball bat she kept for robberies. But he didn't move closer, just stood there looking at her with an expression she couldn't read, something between wonder and horror. But it triggered something older, he continued. A blood bond. And you are now marked as my mate. This was insane. This was impossible, and Emma heard herself say exactly that, her voice shaking but angry now because she'd given him dumplings, not a marriage proposal. What the hell was he talking about? The man, the creature, the thing that had been homeless and was now beautiful and terrifying, closed his eyes like her words caused him physical pain. If you refuse me by sunrise, he said slowly, every vampire clan will sense you as unclaimed. They'll come for you, either to kill you to hurt me or to claim you themselves, and I cannot allow that. The fluorescent lights flickered again, and Emma saw shadows moving wrong in the corners of the store, shapes that didn't match any physical object, and she realized with a clarity that felt like falling that this was real. All of it was real. Vampires were real, and she'd somehow bound herself to one by being kind. Her psychology degree, the 2 years she'd completed before the money ran out, kicked in with clinical observations, noting his body language, the way he kept his distance, the genuine distress in his voice when he said he couldn't allow her to be hunted. And she understood with a strange certainty that he didn't want this either, that whatever had happened between them on that rain-soaked street had trapped them both. "What's your name?" she asked, and he blinked like he'd forgotten he had one. "Lucian," he said. "Lucian Corvus. And I was king once, before my sister cursed me for refusing to spill innocent blood, before I spent 70 years invisible and forgotten as punishment for having a conscience." And Emma's grip on the baseball bat loosened because his story matched the misery she'd seen in his eyes those 3 nights, the particular quality of loneliness that came from being unseen, and she knew that loneliness had lived it herself in this fluorescent cage while the world moved on without her. "How long until sunrise?" she asked, and watched something like relief flicker across his impossible face. 4 hours, he said. 4 hours to decide if you'll bind yourself to me in name and blood, or face every vampire in the Pacific Northwest hunting you as unclaimed prey. Outside, the rain had stopped, and Portland's October night pressed against the windows, and Emma Chen, invisible cashier who'd been going through motions for 3 years, felt the first stirring of something that might have been terror, or might have been the strange electric feeling that her life had finally, catastrophically, begun to matter. The shadows in the quick stop stretched and folded, and suddenly Emma was somewhere else, her stomach lurching with the sensation of falling upward. And when the world solidified again, she was standing in her own studio apartment in the Hawthorne district, Lucian beside her, looking as disoriented as she felt, and she realized with a start that he'd never been here before. He'd somehow pulled her location from her mind and transported them through darkness itself. He staggered slightly and caught himself on her second-hand IKEA table, and Emma saw wonder flash across his face as he touched the cheap wood like it was mahogany, looked around her cramped space with its unmade futon bed and stacks of library books and instant ramen stockpile like he was seeing Versailles. 70 years, he said softly, and she understood he meant 70 years since he'd been inside anywhere, since he'd felt texture under his fingers, or warmth from heating vents, or seen the small, personal details that made a space someone's home. And despite everything, despite the terror still singing in her veins, Emma felt a pang of sympathy for what that kind of isolation must have done to him. She offered him water, an automatic hostess gesture from her mother's training, but he shook his head and moved to the window, keeping the width of her tiny apartment between them, and she noticed for the first time how carefully he was controlling himself, how his hands stayed visible and empty, how he'd positioned himself where she could see the door, giving her an escape route even though they both knew she couldn't outrun him. Lucien began explaining vampire hierarchy in that formal, careful way he had, how the Pacific Northwest territories were governed by bloodline courts, how his sister Seraphine now ruled what he'd lost, how the blood bond that had formed when Emma's kindness broke his curse was irrevocable, ancient magic that predated even vampire law, and Emma found herself analyzing him the way she'd learned in her 2 years of psychology courses before the money ran out, noting the self-loathing in how he couldn't meet her eyes, the guilt in how he kept apologizing, the aristocratic manners that spoke of a different era. "You were king," she said, interrupting his explanation of vampire politics. "And you gave it up for humans. Why would you do that?" The question seemed to catch him off guard, and he turned from the window, crimson eyes meeting hers for the first time since they'd arrived, and she saw centuries of weariness in them. "Because power means nothing if it requires you to become a monster," he said quietly, and told her about the village, a small logging community in the Cascades that had discovered their existence, how his court had demanded he order their massacre to protect vampire secrecy, how he'd seen children playing in the dirt streets and realized somewhere along his 3 centuries of existence he'd forgotten that vampires had been human once too, that they'd become predators who justified any cruelty as survival. Emma listened as he described his refusal, how his sister Seraphine had called it weakness, how she'd led a coup with the backing of vampires who believed human lives were acceptable collateral damage, how dozens of their kind had died in the conflicts with werewolf packs and witch covens who'd seen the leadership change as an opportunity to test vampire strength. "And your sister cursed you for having a conscience," Emma said, and Lucian's laugh was bitter. "She cursed me for weakness," he corrected, and in her view she wasn't wrong. "My choice to spare that village cost vampire lives. I chose humans over our kind, and people died because of it." Emma stood and moved closer despite the warning bells in her head, studying his face, and said slowly, "So you've been punishing yourself ever since, living as forgotten and invisible as you made those vampires feel when you protected humans instead of them." Lucian went very still, and Emma knew she'd hit something true, some core wound he'd been carrying for 70 years, and his voice when he spoke was barely a whisper asking how she could possibly see that. 2 years of psychology courses," she said, "and 3 years watching people at their worst during graveyard shifts. You learn to read what people don't say." She moved to her small kitchen area, needing distance and activity, and asked the question that mattered most: "If I say yes to this marriage, what does it actually mean?" Lucian's shoulders relaxed slightly like he was relieved to return to practical matters, and he explained it would be in name only, she'd be under his protection, the bond would grant her some of his powers as a shield against other vampires. He would ask nothing of her except survival. Because if she lived, then his choice 70 years ago to value human life wasn't entirely for nothing. Emma heard what he didn't say, that he'd built his entire identity around that one act of conscience, and her continued existence would be proof it had mattered, and she felt the weight of that, being someone's redemption narrative. But she also heard the genuine care in his voice, the way he kept giving her information and options, even though it would be easier to compel her. The shadows outside her window moved wrong, and Lucian's entire demeanor changed, becoming predatory and alert, and he told her in a voice gone cold that they had company. Seraphine's scouts had found them faster than he'd expected. Emma looked where he was looking and saw shapes that bent light strangely, humanoid but wrong. And her heart started hammering because this was real. All of it was real. There were vampires outside her apartment building, and they were here because of her. Lucian moved to the door and told her to stay back, his voice absolute command now, and Emma saw him transform from the guilty, conflicted man into something ancient and dangerous, saw the king he'd been emerging how he held himself. The door exploded inward and 3 figures came through, faster than Emma's eyes could track, and Lucian met them in a blur of motion that her mind couldn't quite process, bodies moving at speeds that shouldn't be possible, and she heard sounds like breaking stone, smelled something acrid and wrong. One of the vampires got past Lucian and came at Emma with a smile that showed too many teeth, and she grabbed the first thing her hand found, a cast iron skillet from her dish rack, and swung it with all her strength born of terror and 3 years of repressed rage at a life that had gone nowhere. The vampire caught it easily, laughing, but the distraction gave Lucien time to cross the room and do something Emma's eyes couldn't follow, and suddenly there was ash. Just ash drifting down like snow, and the vampire was gone. Lucien destroyed the other two with an efficiency that was beautiful and horrible, moving like violence choreographed by someone who'd had centuries to perfect the art of killing. And when it was over, he stood in her ruined doorway covered in ash, breathing hard, looking at his hands with an expression of such profound horror that Emma understood he hated what he'd just done, hated what he was capable of being. "More will come," he said without looking at her. "Seraphine is testing us, seeing if the bond is real, and we have perhaps 2 hours until dawn, perhaps less if she decides to commit real resources to this." Emma's apartment felt smaller suddenly, the walls too thin, the night too full of predators who moved too fast and died in ash, and she realized she was shaking, but not from fear anymore, from adrenaline, from the electric understanding that she'd just hit a vampire with a frying pan and was somehow still alive. She looked at Lucien, really looked at him, saw past the aristocratic beauty to the man underneath who'd given up a kingdom because he couldn't stomach killing children, who'd spent 70 years in invisible exile as penance, who was now offering her a choice between impossible options, while clearly hoping she'd refuse him because he didn't think he deserved anything good. The sketches on her walls caught her eye, her hobby drawings of Portland street scenes, all empty of people because she'd never been good at drawing humans, had always felt more comfortable with buildings and trees, inanimate things that didn't require understanding connection. And she realized that was her. That was her life, empty of real connection because she'd been invisible for so long she'd forgotten how to be seen. "If I do this," she heard herself say, "if I agree to this binding or marriage or whatever it is, you have to promise me something." Lucien looked up from his ash-covered hands, crimson eyes wary, and Emma continued, "You have to promise you'll tell me the truth. Always. Even when it makes you look bad. Even when you think I can't handle it. Because I'm so tired of being treated like I'm invisible, or stupid, or fragile." Something shifted in Lucien's expression, a crack in his careful control, and he nodded slowly. "I promise," he said, and Emma believed him because she'd learned to read liars during 3 years of night shifts, and whatever else he was, this vampire king was painfully, almost pathologically honest. Outside her broken door she heard sirens in the distance. Someone had probably reported the noise, and she had maybe an hour and a half until dawn, until the deadline for a choice that would change everything, and Emma Chen, who'd been invisible and going nowhere, made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. She told Lucien they should prepare for this binding ceremony, because if she was going to stop being invisible, she might as well do it spectacularly. And she saw relief and terror war across his beautiful, terrible face in equal measure. Emma Chen had never imagined her wedding would happen in a studio apartment that smelled like instant ramen and vampire ash. But then again, she'd never imagined she'd marry at all. Certainly not to a 300-year-old vampire king with guilt complex and eyes like rubies. But here she was at 4:15 a.m., with 90 minutes until dawn making demands. Because if she was going to bind herself to immortal, supernatural politics, she was damn well going to do it on her terms. She told Lucien she wanted vows, real ones, that he would never use whatever bond they were creating to control her will, never feed from her without explicit permission, and help her protect her human family from the vampire world he was dragging her into. And she watched something like awe cross his face as he agreed immediately to every condition. Then he added his own, and his voice shook when he said it, that he vowed to dissolve this marriage the moment it became safe for her, even if it cost him everything, even if it meant returning to the curse, and Emma understood he was giving her an escape route from himself, from the guilt he carried like a second skin. The ceremony itself was nothing like the weddings Emma had half-heartedly imagined during her brief engagement to her college boyfriend, who'd left when the money for school ran out. No white dress or flowers or crying relatives. Just Lucian producing a blade from somewhere in his coat that looked older than America, its handle wrapped in leather gone dark with age and use. He explained in that formal, careful way that vampire marriages were blood bonds, literal and permanent, that she would taste his blood and he would taste hers, and they would speak words in a language that predated Latin, predated most of human civilization, words that would bind their lives together until one of them turned to ash. Emma's hands trembled as she took the blade, but her voice was steady when she told him to start. And Lucian cut his palm with practiced efficiency, blood welling up darker than human blood, almost black in her apartment's lighting. He offered his hand and Emma took it, feeling his blood slick and warm against her skin. And then she was raising his palm to her mouth and tasting copper and something else, something that sang in her veins like electricity and old magic. The world exploded into visions that weren't hers, memories flooding through her mind faster than thought. She saw Lucien young and human in a world of candlelight and plague, saw his turning, centuries of existence bleeding together. The weight of crown and court. The village he'd saved full of children who looked like every child who'd ever lived. And then 70 years of wandering, 70 years of being invisible while the world moved around him, being untouchable while humans passed through him like smoke, the loneliness so profound it had its own gravity. And Emma gasped because she knew that loneliness had lived a smaller version of it herself, and she understood they were the same, both of them unseen by the world they lived in. Lucian's voice pulled her back, speaking words in that ancient language, sounds that felt like they should break human throats, and Emma found herself responding in the same tongue though she'd never heard it before, the blood bond feeding her the words she needed. She took the blade with hands that had stopped shaking and cut her own palm, smaller and shallower than his cut but enough, and offered her hand the way he had. Lucien's eyes met hers, and she saw a question there, last chance to refuse, but Emma nodded, and he brought her palm to his mouth, and she felt his lips, cool and careful, felt the draw as he tasted her blood. Power slammed into her like a physical force, her apartment's walls suddenly irrelevant. She could hear every heartbeat in the building, smell rain on pavement 3 blocks away, see in perfect clarity despite the darkness. And under it all, she felt Lucien, felt his presence settle into her mind like a second heartbeat, felt his emotions mixing with hers, his guilt and hope and wonder and fear all tangled together. Emma spoke the final words of the binding, felt them leave her mouth in that impossible language. I bind myself to you, Lucian Corvus, not as property, but as partner. I see you, the king you were, the wanderer you became, the man you're trying to be. Lucian's response broke from tradition. She could feel through the bond that these weren't the standard words. He said, I bind myself to you, Emma Chen, not as master, but as guardian. I vow you will never be invisible again. The bond completed with a snap. Emma felt in her bones, in her teeth, in the marrow of her existence, and suddenly she knew things she shouldn't know. Knew that Lucian's favorite sound was rain on stone. Knew he'd been a poet before his turning. Knew he was terrified he'd just destroyed her life. And when she looked at him, she saw him seeing her the same way, all her small, lonely truths laid bare. The apartment had transformed during the ceremony, shadows moving independent of light sources, the air thick with power that tasted like ozone and old blood. And Emma's sketches on the walls were moving, the buildings she'd drawn swaying like they were breathing. But as the bond settled, everything snapped back to normal, except Emma could still see perfectly in darkness, and hear Lucian's heartbeat across the room, matching rhythm with her own. Then the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant, and frost spread across every surface, Emma's breath misting, and a woman's voice came from the shadows themselves, beautiful and cold and furious. Sweet brother, the voice said, and a figure materialized in Emma's ruined doorway, Not quite solid but present enough, a woman who looked like Lucienne if Lucienne had been carved from ice and cruelty, pale and perfect, and absolutely terrifying. You always did have a weakness for strays, the woman continued. And Emma knew this was Seraphine, the sister who'd cursed Lucienne, the current vampire queen. This human has no idea what she stepped into, Seraphine said, studying Emma like an interesting insect. Vampire court in 14 days, or I will paint Portland red finding you both. Lucian moved faster than Emma's new enhanced vision could track, placing himself between her and Seraphine's projection, and his voice when he spoke was different, deeper, the voice of someone who'd commanded courts and armies. You'll have to go through me first, he said, and Seraphine laughed, the sound like breaking glass. I already did, she replied. Once, remember how that ended? And then she was gone, the temperature returning to normal, frost melting away like it had never been. Emma stood in her destroyed apartment, newly married to a vampire, partially immortal herself, based on the power still singing in her veins, with a 14-day deadline to face a court that wanted her dead, and she heard herself say, "Your sister is terrifying." Lucian turned to her and his hands were shaking, actual tremors she could see even with her normal human vision, and he said yes, and I just made you her enemy. I'm so sorry. Emma moved to him before she could second-guess it, her psychology training noting the shame spiral he was falling into, and she took his shaking hands in hers, first voluntary touch since the blood bond, and felt the jolt of connection, felt his emotions crash into hers, guilt and self-hatred, and a protectiveness so fierce it felt like violence. Stop apologizing, she said firmly. I made my choice, now teach me how to survive it. Through the bond she felt his surprise, his gratitude, his fear for her, and underneath it all something else, something that felt like the beginning of hope. And Emma realized that the power flooding through her wasn't just vampire strength and enhanced senses, it was also this ability to feel another person completely, to know she wasn't alone in her own head anymore, and it was terrifying and intoxicating in equal measure. Lucian's fingers tightened around hers, and he said there was much to teach her. That the partial turning she'd undergone meant she'd retained her humanity, her ability to walk in daylight while gaining vampire powers, that she was something rare and dangerous now, a bridge between worlds that most vampires would want to control or destroy. Emma looked down at their joined hands, his pale against her brown skin, both of them marked with cuts that were already healing, vampire blood doing its work, and she felt the weight of what she'd agreed to settling over her like a cloak she couldn't remove. Outside her broken door, she could hear Portland waking up, delivery trucks and early commuters, the normal world continuing while hers had irrevocably changed, and through the bond she felt Lucian's awareness of dawn approaching, felt his need to find shelter from sunlight, felt his reluctance to leave her, even though they were connected now in ways that transcended physical presence. We have 14 days, Emma said aloud, testing how it felt to speak strategy instead of just reacting to crisis. 14 days before we face your sister's court, so we need a plan. Lucian looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, even with the bond's emotional feedback, and he said, "You're not running, not trying to undo this." And Emma laughed, the sound slightly hysterical because she was exhausted and overwhelmed, and had just married a vampire king. Where exactly would I run to? Every vampire can apparently sense this bond now. She felt his guilt spike again through their connection and squeezed his hands harder, stopping that spiral before it started. No, she said, no more guilt. We survive this together or not at all. Those are the terms. The bond hummed between them, carrying emotions faster than words, and Emma felt the moment Lucienne accepted it, accepted her partnership instead of trying to protect her from himself. And something settled in her chest, some certainty she couldn't name, but felt true all the way down to her bones that had become harder than human bones, stronger, built to last centuries instead of decades. Dawn arrived with the particular quality of light that only October in Portland could produce, soft and gray filtering through rain-cleaned air, and Lucian stood at Emma's window watching the sun rise over the city for the first time in 70 years, careful to stay in shadow where direct light wouldn't touch him, but close enough to see the world wake up in shades of gold and pink. Emma watched him, watching the sunrise, and felt through the bond his wonder mixed with grief, the bittersweet ache of experiencing something beautiful he'd thought lost forever. And she realized she should call work, should try to maintain some normalcy, but the word normal had lost all meaning sometime between giving a homeless man dumplings and binding herself in blood to a vampire king. She pulled out her phone with hands that still looked like hers, but felt different, stronger, and called the quick stop for the first time in 3 years to say she was sick, listened to her manager's annoyed response, and felt a strange detachment, like that life belonged to someone else. Lucian turned from the window and said quietly that he'd forgotten how beautiful the world is, 70 years of darkness, and she'd given him this back. But Emma shook her head and said she'd given him dumplings. The curse broke itself. No, Lucian said with an intensity that made her meet his eyes. Curses don't break from food, they break from intention. You saw someone suffering and you chose to help. That's rare. That's everything. Emma moved to her tiny kitchen area needing activity, needing something normal, and started making coffee even though she could feel through the bond that Lucian couldn't drink it anymore. His body no longer processing human food the way hers still could. She asked him about his life before the exile, before the curse, and Lucian settled carefully onto her second-hand couch, like he was afraid it might break under his weight, and told her he'd been turned during the Renaissance in Venice, been human once with a human name he barely remembered, had ruled the Pacific Northwest territories for 2 centuries, trying to modernize vampire relations with werewolf packs and witch covens, believing that supernatural species could coexist without the constant territorial violence that had defined the previous millennium. Emma poured coffee into her chipped mug and sat across from him in the apartment's only chair and told him about her own life. Immigrant parents from Taiwan who'd sacrificed everything to give her opportunities, their dreams of her becoming a doctor, the way she'd dropped out of Portland State when the money ran out and the loans piled up, how she'd been working night shifts ever since feeling like she was disappearing a little more each day. Through the bond she felt Lucien's recognition, felt him understanding that they'd both been invisible in different ways. Him cursed to literal invisibility, and her cursed by the particular kind of urban loneliness that came from being surrounded by people who never really saw you. The coffee tasted different to Emma's enhanced senses. She could detect every note and undertone, and the sensory input was overwhelming. Too much information flooding her brain at once. Lucien noticed her wince and asked what was wrong, and when she explained that everything was too loud, too bright, too much, he moved to kneel in front of her chair with movements careful and deliberate, giving her time to refuse. He positioned his hands gently over her ears, not quite touching, and taught her in that formal, patient way to imagine filters, to sort stimuli into categories and choose what to pay attention to, his voice low and steady while Emma learned to turn down the volume on the world. His hands were cool against her skin when he finally made contact, and Emma didn't flinch, felt through the bond his surprise that she trusted him this close. And she realized it was the first moment of genuine warmth between them, teaching and learning, partnership instead of crisis. She made a comment about vampire politics seeming like retail, but with more murder. And Lucian laughed, an actual surprised laugh that transformed his face from tragic nobility to something younger and more human. And Emma felt through the bond that it was the first time he'd laughed in 70 years, felt the joy and pain of that mixed together. They talked through the morning, Emma learning about supernatural hierarchies and ancient laws, Lucian learning about modern technology and how the world had changed in his invisible decades, and the conversation had an odd domesticity to it, 2 people getting to know each other over coffee while Portland's traffic sounds filtered through broken door frames. Around 9 a.m., Emma's phone rang with her mother's distinctive ringtone, and her stomach dropped. She'd forgotten it was Tuesday, their weekly dim-sum day, and through the bond, she felt Lucien's awareness of her panic. Emma answered and heard her mother's voice, warm and concerned, asking if she was all right. She'd called the restaurant and they said Emma had called in sick. Was she eating enough? Was she taking care of herself? And Emma heard lies come out of her mouth. Yes, Mom, I'm fine, just a cold. I'll come next week, I promise. Lies that felt like ash on her tongue because she'd never lied to her mother about anything important. Her mother said she sounded different, was something wrong, and Emma felt tears prick her eyes as she said, No, nothing's wrong. I love you, Mom. I'll call you soon, and hung up before her voice could break. The weight of what she'd done hit her all at once. She'd bound herself to a world her family could never know about, would spend however many years or decades or centuries lying to the people who'd raised her, watching them age while she stayed young, eventually watching them die while she continued, and she put her face in her hands and felt the grief crash over her like a wave. Lucien was beside her instantly, not touching but present, and through the bond Emma felt his guilt multiply. Felt him make some decision that tasted like sacrifice and resignation. He said quietly that he would find a way to undo this. There must be a way to break the bond and return her to her normal life, even if it meant he returned to the curse, even if it cost him everything, because he couldn't keep her in this world when it meant losing her family. Emma looked up at him through tears and felt something fierce rise in her chest, anger maybe or defiance, and she said, To what? Return me to what, exactly? My thrilling life of night shifts and instant ramen? Being so lonely I talked to the stray cat in the alley. He didn't steal her from paradise. Lucien's expression was pure anguish when he said he'd stolen her choice, and Emma stood abruptly, pacing her small apartment with her new vampire speed that made the walls blur. And then you gave it back, she said sharply. You could have compelled me, forced me, but you didn't. You laid out the options and let me choose. That's more choice than I've had in years. She could feel through the bond that Lucien didn't believe her, that his guilt was too deep, too foundational to his sense of self. And Emma realized that this was the wound at his core, that he'd been punishing himself for 70 years for choosing conscience over his people, that he'd decided he didn't deserve happiness or redemption or any kind of future that wasn't suffering. Her psychology training kicked in, pattern recognition, understanding that trauma responses, and she stopped pacing and looked at him directly. You're going to spend the next 14 days trying to sacrifice yourself for me, she said. It's what you do. It's what you've always done. Noble self-destruction disguised as honor. Lucien stood slowly, and Emma felt through the bond his shock that she could see him so clearly, see past the aristocratic manners and formal distance to the self-loathing underneath. I won't let you destroy yourself to save me from a choice I made willingly, Emma continued. We're in this together. That's what the bond means. Partnership, not martyrdom. She moved closer to him, close enough to see the crimson flecks in his eyes, close enough to feel his careful, controlled breathing. You gave me back visibility, she said more gently. You made me matter in a way I haven't mattered in years. And yes, it's terrifying. And yes, I'll have to lie to my family. And yes, we might die in 14 days, but I'm not invisible anymore. I'm not going through motions waiting for a life that never starts. And that's worth something. Through the bond, Emma felt Lucien's emotions roiling, guilt and wonder, and something that might have been the beginning of hope. And she felt the exact moment he stopped trying to convince her to leave and started trying to figure out how they would survive together. The apartment felt smaller with both of them standing, felt intimate in a way that had nothing to do with the bond and everything to do with two lonely people recognizing each other. And Emma realized that somewhere between the blood ceremony and this moment, they'd stopped being strangers bound by magic and started being something else, something that didn't have a name yet, but felt real. Lucian asked what she wanted to do with the time before they faced Seraphine's court, and Emma looked around her apartment with its broken door and ash stains and sketches that had moved during the ceremony, looked at the life she'd built out of loneliness and making do, and said she wanted to learn everything, wanted to understand the world she'd stepped into, wanted to be ready to face whatever came, not as a victim, but as someone who belonged there. She felt through the bond Lucian's surprise and approval, felt him seeing her not as fragile human to protect, but as partner to prepare, and when he smiled, it transformed his face again, made him look less like a tragic painting and more like someone who might remember how to be happy. Outside Emma's window, Portland continued its normal Tuesday morning, people going to work and school, living lives that would never intersect with vampire courts or blood bonds or the impossible choice between family and freedom. And Emma felt the weight of her double life settle over her like a cloak she was learning to wear, heavy but hers, chosen in a way her old life never was. And through the bond she felt Lucian's presence like a second heartbeat, steady and sure, and realized that for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't alone, wasn't invisible, wasn't waiting for her life to start because it already had, catastrophically and irrevocably, and she was more afraid and more alive than she'd ever been. Emma tried to sleep after Lucian insisted she needed rest, her body still human enough to require it, despite the vampire blood singing in her veins. But the moment she closed her eyes, she was drowning in memories that weren't hers, the blood bond translating Lucian's centuries into dreams that felt more real than her own life. She saw through his eyes as his sister Seraphine stood before him in a throne room carved from stone, her face beautiful and cold as she pronounced his sentence for treason, saw the moment the curse took hold and the world began to fade, colors bleeding away until everything was gray and distant, felt 70 years of wandering compress into a nightmare of isolation so profound it had its own weight, its own gravity that pulled at her even in sleep. Emma woke gasping at 2 p.m. to find Lucian sitting at her tiny kitchen table with her laptop open, his face illuminated by the screen's glow. And she could feel through the bond, his careful focus mixed with frustration as he navigated a world of technology that hadn't existed during his curse. He looked up when she stirred, and something vulnerable crossed his face. Concern and guilt that she'd been dreaming his memories, feeling his pain secondhand through the bond they shared. Emma asked what he was researching and watched his expression close off slightly as he explained he'd found references to bond-breaking rituals in obscure vampire texts, all of them requiring consent of both parties and a blood sacrifice, something living and significant given willingly to sever what had been joined. Before Emma could process that, before she could ask if he was seriously still trying to find a way to undo what they'd done, the temperature in her apartment dropped 30 degrees, and 3 figures materialized in her living space, not shadow projections like Seraphine, but solid physical vampires, ancient ones based on the power that rolled off them like heat. The tallest one, a man with features that might have been Scandinavian centuries ago, smiled with too many teeth and said the queen requested their presence. She was so eager to meet the human foolish enough to bind herself to a failed king, and Emma felt through the bond Lucien's rage spike hot and immediate. Lucien stood slowly, placing himself between Emma and the emissaries, and said in a voice gone deadly quiet that they would attend court on the agreed timeline, 14 days, not before. The Scandinavian vampire laughed and said the queen had changed her mind, wanted to see what her brother had bound himself to, wanted to assess whether the human was worth the trouble of allowing the bond to stand, and Emma felt her own anger rise to match Lucien's, because she was tired of being discussed like property, like an object to be assessed and judged. She stood and moved to Lucien's side instead of behind him, and said she wasn't going anywhere until the agreed-upon time, and the 3 vampires looked at her with expressions mixing amusement and contempt. The attack came faster than Emma's enhanced vision could fully track, the Scandinavian vampire moving toward Lucien, while the other 2 came at Emma from different angles, and she discovered her new body could react on instinct, could move with speed that blurred the world, could meet one vampire's lunge with strength that surprised them both. But she was untrained, operating on reflex while they had centuries of experience, and within seconds, one of them had her pinned against the wall. Fingers wrapped around her throat, leaning in close enough that she could smell old blood on his breath. He said something about draining her just enough to teach Lucian a lesson about refusing Seraphine's summons, and Emma felt genuine fear spike through her, felt through the bond Lucian's awareness of her danger, and then everything changed. The power that exploded from Lucian was nothing like what Emma had seen before. This was ancient and absolute, king-level magic that made the air itself bow and break, and he moved through the three vampires like they were made of paper, destroying them with an efficiency that spoke of centuries of rule, of battles fought and won, of a ruthlessness Emma hadn't known he possessed. The vampire holding Emma disintegrated into ash before he could scream, and Emma slid down the wall, watching Lucian tear through the other two with movements that were beautiful and horrible, watching him become something she'd only seen glimpses of, the monster underneath the guilt and honor and careful manners. It was over in seconds, her apartment filled with ash that drifted like snow, and Lucian stood in the center of the destruction, looking at his hands with an expression of such profound horror that Emma felt it echo through the bond, felt his self-loathing crash over both of them like a wave. He started apologizing immediately, words tumbling out, sorry she had to see that, sorry he brought this to her door, sorry he was still the same monster who had terrified courts and conquered territories, and Emma felt her fear spike, felt him feel it through the bond, watched him retreat to the far corner of her apartment, making himself small and unthreatening, hands visible and empty, giving her space to run if she wanted. But Emma's fear wasn't of him. Not exactly. It was fear of the violence itself, of how easy it had been for him to kill. And underneath that was her psychology training, noting his body language, the way he was trying to disappear into the corner, the way his self-hatred was eating him alive. She stood slowly and moved toward him, watching him tense and try to make himself smaller, and she realized with sudden clarity that he was more afraid of himself than she was of him, that he'd spent 70 years trying to atone for the violence he was capable of, and now he'd done it again to protect her. "Stop," Emma said, and Lucian flinched like she'd hit him. "You protected me," she continued, moving closer. "That's not the same as what you're afraid of becoming." Lucian's voice when he spoke was broken, asking how she could be sure. He'd felt satisfaction when he destroyed them. For a moment he'd enjoyed the violence and the power and the absolute control. How could she not see the monster he was? Emma reached him and knelt so they were eye level, him crouched in the corner, and her offering presence instead of distance. And she said slowly that he enjoyed protecting someone he cared about. That was human, even for a vampire. There was a difference between violence to dominate and violence to defend. She watched something crack in Lucien's expression, and then he was crying, actual tears that looked wrong on his ancient face. First tears in 70 years, based on what she felt through the bond. And Emma pulled him toward her without thinking, let him rest his head against her shoulder while he shook with sobs that sounded like they were being torn from his chest. She held him in the corner of her destroyed apartment, surrounded by vampire ash and broken furniture, and felt through the bond the exact moment something fundamental shifted between them, intimacy that went beyond magic or survival, recognition that felt like falling and flying at the same time. Emma ran her fingers through his hair, wiped ash from his face with gentle touches, and felt Lucien's wonder through the bond that she was touching him with tenderness after watching him kill, that she wasn't running or recoiling but choosing to stay. They stayed like that until the tears stopped and Lucian pulled back enough to meet her eyes, his face raw and vulnerable in a way she'd never seen, and Emma felt through the bond what he couldn't say aloud, that he was falling for her, and it terrified him because he still believed he'd have to let her go. She felt her own feelings echo back through the connection, The way she was falling too, despite the impossible circumstances, despite knowing him less than a day, because the bond meant they knew each other in ways that transcended time, knew each other's loneliness and fear and desperate hope for something better. They cleaned the apartment together in silence that felt comfortable rather than awkward. Domestic activity made surreal by vampire ash, and Emma's enhanced strength making furniture rearrangement trivial. And Emma was just thinking they might have a few hours of peace when there was a knock at her newly repaired door, and her mother's voice called out in Mandarin, asking if Emma was home. Panic shot through Emma, and she felt Lucian's immediate response through the bond. He melted into shadows in the corner, not invisible like his curse had made him, but concealed in a way that human eyes would slide past without noticing. And Emma smoothed her shirt and opened the door to find her mother holding a container of soup, face creased with worry. Emma's mother pushed past her into the apartment, talking rapidly in Mandarin about how Emma had sounded wrong on the phone, how she never got sick, what was really going on, and Emma felt the weight of her double life crushing her as she lied in her mother tongue, saying she was fine, just tired. Work had been stressful. Her mother studied her with eyes that had watched Emma grow up, that knew her better than anyone, and said slowly in English that Emma looked different, tired but also alive. When was the last time she'd looked alive instead of just going through motions? Emma felt tears prick her eyes at the observation, at how her mother could see the change even if she couldn't understand the cause. And she said she'd just been thinking about things, about her life, nothing to worry about. She made tea while her mother settled on the couch, maintaining normalcy while hyper-aware of Lucienne hidden in shadows, of her own enhanced senses picking up every detail, of how her hands moved with vampire grace that her mother might notice if she was paying attention. They talked for an hour, careful conversation where Emma deflected questions about work and dating and future plans, and her mother eventually left with instructions to call more often and promises to come to dim sum next week. And Emma closed the door behind her, feeling like she'd been holding her breath the entire time. Lucienne materialized from the shadows, and Emma leaned against the door, feeling the full weight of what her life had become, secrets layered on secrets, lying to the person who'd raised her, knowing it would only get worse. Through the bond, she felt Lucienne's guilt resurface, and she cut it off sharply, telling him without words that this wasn't his fault, this was her choice, and she was still choosing it. But they needed to face facts. She moved to the window and looked out at Portland's early evening lights, the city she'd lived in for years but never really belonged to, and made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff for the second time in 24 hours. "We're going to that court," Emma said aloud, and felt Lucienne's shock through the bond. "We're facing your sister," she continued, "because if we run, she'll use my family to draw us out. She'll threaten my mother to force compliance. Better to meet her on our terms." Lucienne moved to stand beside her and said carefully that Vampire Court was terrifying, deadly, full of politics and ancient grudges that could destroy them both. Emma turned to face him and smiled without humor, saying it sounded like every family dinner she'd been to, all performance and hidden knives, and they were going together, as partners, as equals. Through the bond, Emma felt Lucian's fear for her mixed with pride, and something that felt like love, though neither of them had named it, felt him accept her decision, not because he agreed, but because he was learning to see her as an equal instead of someone to protect. And together they stood on her fire escape, watching Portland's lights spread below them like earthbound stars, the city that felt both protective and fragile, knowing they had less than 2 weeks to prepare for a confrontation that could end with them both as ash, but choosing to face it anyway because running meant living in fear forever, and Emma had been invisible and afraid long enough. Emma and Lucian Shadow walked to the Vampire Court at 1 minute past midnight on Wednesday, 13 days before the deadline Seraphine had given them. But Emma had decided waiting meant letting fear control their choices, and she was done being controlled by anything or anyone. The darkness folded around them like fabric, and when it released them, they stood at the entrance to tunnels beneath Forest Park, ancient passages that descended into earth that smelled of stone and old blood and magic that predated the city above. Lucian's hand tightened on hers as they walked down corridors lit by torches that burned with cold fire, blue and green flames that gave light but no warmth. And Emma could feel through the bond his dread mixing with determination, his certainty that he was walking her toward her death. The court chamber opened before them like a cathedral carved from living rock, vaulted ceilings dripping with stalactites that had grown for millennia. And hundreds of vampires filled the space, ancient ones whose power made the air thick and hard to breathe, even with Emma's enhanced lungs. Seraphine sat on a throne of obsidian at the far end, beautiful and terrible in a gown that looked like it was woven from shadows, her crimson eyes fixed on them as they entered, and Emma felt every vampire in the room assess her, felt their contempt and curiosity and hunger like physical weight. Seraphine's voice carried through the chamber without her raising it, asking what had brought her wayward brother and his pet human to court so early. Had they tired of playing house in that pathetic apartment? And Emma felt Lucian's rage spike through the bond, but he kept walking, kept his head high, leading Emma to the center of the chamber, where all eyes could see them clearly. Seraphine stood and descended from her throne with movements too graceful to be human, circling them like a predator circling prey, and she said to Lucian that he'd always been too soft, 70 years cursed, and the first human who showed him kindness, he chained himself to her. How pathetic. Emma opened her mouth to respond, but Lucian squeezed her hand once, a request to let him speak, and then he released her and did something that shocked the entire court into silence. He knelt. Not a warrior's crouch, but a full supplicant's kneel, head bowed, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. He said he didn't ask for his crown back, didn't ask for forgiveness or acceptance. He asked only one thing: that Emma go free, that her family go free from any future vampire politics. And he would swear before this court that he would never challenge Seraphine's rule, would give up everything if his sister gave Emma nothing but safety. The court erupted in whispers, and Seraphine's expression went cold and calculating, and she asked if Lucien would truly give up everything for a human cashier who'd shown him one moment of kindness. Lucien raised his head and met his sister's eyes, and said he already did. 70 years ago he gave up his crown for humans he didn't know. This time he was giving it up for one he loved. Emma felt the word love resonate through the bond, felt Lucien's certainty and fear mixing together, felt him mean it with every particle of his being, and something in her chest cracked open. Seraphine studied her brother with an expression Emma couldn't read, and then looked at Emma with eyes that saw too much. And she said she would grant Lucien's request, but with conditions. Emma must choose. She could accept Lucien's abdication and live as a vampire with him in permanent exile from court, immortal but hunted if she ever entered vampire politics. Or she could dissolve the bond, return to humanity losing her powers and her memories of Lucian, and live her normal life. Emma started to speak, but Seraphine raised a hand and said Emma would have 1 hour to decide in isolation. Lucien would be held separately, so he couldn't influence her choice, and before either of them could protest, guards materialized and pulled Lucien away. And through the bond, Emma felt his despair, felt him begging her silently to choose freedom, to choose her family, to let him go. Emma was escorted to a chamber carved from white stone with a mirror that showed her reflection in perfect detail, and she saw herself with vampire-enhanced vision, saw the power in how she held herself, the inhuman grace in her movements, the crimson flecks in her eyes that marked her as other. She thought about her mother's dumplings, about dim sum Tuesdays and family gatherings, about the ordinary life she'd lived for 24 years. Invisible and lonely, but safe and familiar. Then she thought about Lucian's loneliness matching hers across centuries, about his honor that had cost him everything, about his brokenness that mirrored her own. about how being seen by him had made her feel visible for the first time in years. Through the bond, fainter now, but still present, Emma felt Lucien's emotions, felt him begging her to choose the normal life, to save herself, to forget him and be happy, and she realized Seraphine hadn't been able to fully suppress their connection. Emma closed her eyes and sent a thought back through the bond, pushing it with all her will. I choose you, not because of magic, but because you see me. She felt Lucian's shock reverberate through their connection, felt his disbelief and desperate hope, and Emma opened her eyes and looked at her reflection one more time, seeing not a victim, but someone who finally mattered, who had power, who was seen. She walked back to the court chamber where Seraphine waited on her throne and hundreds of vampires watched with predatory interest, and Emma's voice didn't shake when she announced her decision. She accepted the exile, kept the bond, chose Lucian. The court erupted in whispers, shock and derision, and a few sounds that might have been approval, but Emma wasn't finished. She looked directly at Seraphine and said she had her own condition. Seraphine must vow before this court to never harm Emma's human family directly or indirectly, or the vow before this court meant nothing. Seraphine's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Emma thought she'd pushed too far, but then the vampire queen smiled, sharp and approving, and said Emma was braver than she'd expected, or more foolish, but very well. Seraphine stood and spoke in a voice that filled the chamber. I vow before this court that Emma Chen's human family will never be touched by vampire politics while they live. In exchange, she never enters these halls again. Emma said done, and felt the weight of ancient magic seal the vow, felt it settle into her bones like a promise written in blood. Guards released Lucian, and he crossed the chamber in a blur, stopping just before Emma, like he was afraid to touch her, afraid she might disappear, and his voice broke when he said, You chose this. You chose me. Emma reached up and cupped his face in her hands, feeling through the bond his wonder and disbelief and love crashing over both of them, and said, I chose us. There's a difference. Seraphine's voice cut through the moment, cold and final, saying they were free. Her brother was free to wander forever with his human. She hoped Emma was worth eternity. Guards escorted them from the court through tunnels that led to different exits, and when they emerged into Forest Park's pre-dawn darkness, the air tasted like freedom, cool and clean after the underground chamber's wait. Portland's city lights spread below them like earthbound stars, and Emma felt the full reality of what she'd done settle over her. She'd chosen exile and immortality, chosen to never see her family again except from distance, chosen a vampire king who'd been cursed and broken and was now free because of her choices. Lucian pulled her into his arms, and Emma went willingly, feeling his tears on her neck, feeling through the bond his emotions too large for words, gratitude and love and fear and hope all tangled together. She tilted her head up and kissed him, their first real kiss that wasn't ceremony or survival, but choice, and it tasted like his tears mixed with hers, salt and copper and something sweeter, relief and grief and joy all at once. Emma felt Lucian's heartbeat synchronize with hers through the bond, felt them become something new, not king and subject or vampire and human, but partners who'd chosen each other despite every reason not to. And when they finally pulled apart, his smile transformed his face into something that looked like happiness. They stood on the overlook watching dawn approach. Lucien would need to retreat to shadows soon, but Emma with her partial turning could watch the sunrise, and she described it to him as it happened, the colors spreading across Portland's sky, orange and pink and gold painting the city in light. Lucian held her from behind, his face buried in her neck, listening to her voice, and Emma talked about their future, about traveling maybe, about writing the book she'd always wanted to write, about finding other exiles like them, who didn't fit in either world. Lucian said he would spend eternity making sure she never regretted her choice, and Emma laughed, saying he would spend eternity learning to accept he deserved happiness. That was the real challenge. As the sun broke the horizon, Emma whispered, "Thank you for being hungry that night. Thank you for accepting my dumplings." And Lucian's arms tightened around her as he said thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. They stood together as dawn broke over Portland, exiled from both their old worlds, Emma cut off from her family and Lucian banished from his court, but choosing to build something new together, choosing partnership over safety, choosing to be seen over being invisible. And Emma felt through the bond Lucian's love wrapping around her like armor and wings, protective and freeing at the same time. She'd been a cashier going through motions less than 2 days ago, invisible and lonely, and convinced her life would never start. And now she was partially immortal, bonded to a vampire king, exiled from supernatural politics, and more alive than she'd ever been. The cost was real. She'd never sit at dim sum with her mother again, never tell her family the truth about what she'd become, would watch them age from distance while she stayed young, but standing in Lucian's arms watching the sunrise paint Portland in gold, Emma knew she'd choose this again. Would choose being seen and loved and real over being safe and invisible and slowly dying inside. Lucian whispered against her neck that they should find shelter before full sun, his voice rough with emotion, and Emma nodded but didn't move yet, holding this moment a little longer. This first dawn of her new life, this choice she'd made not from compulsion or desperation, but from courage, from recognizing that love, even difficult love, was better than loneliness, that being extraordinary, even at tremendous cost, was better than being ordinary and unseen. Together they walked into Forest Park's shadows, Lucien's hand in hers, the bond between them steady as a heartbeat, two exiles choosing each other over and over with every step. And Emma felt through their connection, his hope matching hers, hope for a future neither of them had thought possible, hope that maybe redemption wasn't about reclaiming what was lost, but about building something new from the broken pieces. And as the sun rose fully over Portland, Emma Chen, who'd given dumplings to a homeless stranger and accidentally bound herself to the vampire king, smiled. Because for the first time in her 24 years, she wasn't invisible. She was seen and loved and choosing her own extraordinary life, and that was worth everything.